Hi folks, we're just giving everybody a few seconds to get logged in. If you are logged in already, you can look in the chat for some info about how to purchase tonight's book and how to get $5 off when you purchase through Greenlight in the next week. All right, good evening and welcome to tonight's live online author event with Greenlight Bookstore. We're excited to host tonight's event with translator Katherine Silver presenting César Aira's latest book, Artforum. She'll be talking with Chris Andrews and Aaron Shulman, so you're in for an excellent time. Before we start, I just want to say a huge thanks to everyone for making this happen and to all of you for showing up. Greenlight storefronts are currently closed and locked, but our community is still here. Now, just a couple of housekeeping things. You can see and hear the speakers. They cannot see or hear you. They can see your name over in our attendee list, and they'll be able to see your name when you send comments in chat or ask questions in our Q&A. There's a couple of different Zoom functions we'll be using throughout the event. And if you scroll or over the bottom of your Zoom window, you'll be able to see them. There's an icon labeled chat. You can use this throughout the event to send comments, comment on what's happening in the conversation to the authors or to your fellow attendees. You can say hello to the authors, provide a little virtual applause after the reading or during high points in the conversation. You'll also see down here at the bottom of your Zoom window an icon labeled Q&A. This is where we'll be pulling questions from during the audience Q&A portion at the end of our event. You can post your questions in there at any time throughout the conversation. And if you see another attendee's question that you would really like to hear answered, you can go ahead and upvote that. And it'll appear at the top of our queue as we're pulling questions from there to ask our translators at the end of the event. We are recording tonight's event, so look for video or audio versions on our website and social channels later on. And tonight's featured book, Artforum, is available for sale from greenlightbookstore.com. Thank you. You can see the book on Aaron's window, and Katherine's window. Though our stores are closed, we're working with our supplier warehouse for fast direct-to-home shipping. If you care about supporting the careers of authors and the ongoing existence of independent bookstores, buying tonight's featured book is a great way to show your support. And we're offering $5 off on a featured book when you purchase it from Greenlight's website in the next week. Look for the coupon code in the chat. Our featured translators for the evening are Chris Andrews, Aaron Shulman, and Katherine Silver. Chris Andrews teaches at Western Sydney University in Australia, where I believe it is about 9:30 on Saturday right now. He has translated books of prose fiction from Spanish and French, including Roberto Bolaño's By Night in Chile, César Aira's Emma the Captive, Selva Almada's The Wind That Lays Waste, and Adini's Our Riches. He has also published 2 collections of poems, Cut Lunch and Lime Green Chair. Aaron Shulman is the author of the nonfiction historical narrative, The Age of Disenchantments, the epic story of Spain's most notorious literary family from the long shadow of the Spanish Civil War. A former Fulbright scholar, his works appeared in The Believer, The New Republic, The American Scholar, The Wall Street Journal, El País, and Hazlitt, among many other places. He is the co-owner of Splash Literary, a book coaching agency that works with authors, agents, and publishers to make sure important stories and ideas find hungry readers. Katherine Silver is an acclaimed and award-winning literary translator. Her most recent and forthcoming publications include works by Juan Carlos Zanetti, Maria Sonia Christoph, César Aira, and Julio Ramon Ribeiro. She is the former director of the Banff International Literary Translation Center and the author of Echo Understory. Aira's new book, Artforum, is certainly one of his most charming, quirky, and funny books to date, consisting of a series of interrelated stories about his compulsion to collect Artforum magazine. Katherine is going to start us off with a reading from the book, and then she'll be talking with Chris and Aaron and with all of you. Katherine, please take it away.
Okay. Hi, everybody. Thank you for being here or there or wherever you are. I'm going to read a little excerpt on page 59 and 60 and then read the entirety of the chapter called Melancholy. So the first excerpt, it includes a word that corresponds to the only word I've ever queried Aira about, and it turns out he responded by saying, it's a word only I use, I made it up. So I made up the word tokades to sort of mirror that the best I could. The conclusion I hope to reach with this story of some of my tokades was the following. The most dissimilar facts can be connected in such a way that they participate in the same story, and their incoherence can become coherent. If you get a call for the wrong number, it's going to rain. If a pigeon alights on the balcony rail, there's going to be a subway strike. If a country changes its name, a relative is going to die. There are no restrictions. There are no forbidden subjects. The entire universe in its innumerable manifestations is at our disposal. The only restriction is chance, which doesn't restrict anything because it is by definition what allows for everything and places in communication the beings that are most remote as well as those that are closest to each other, crossing over levels, planes, languages. Nobody believes in what's unbelievable, but we all surrender to superstitions in one way or another. Superstition is the plausible part of the supernatural. It is sustained by desire, enthusiasm, necessity, which flesh it out, anchoring it in life and justifying all the shapes it takes. A solid and coherent system of superstitions is a religion, and an entire civilization can be built from there. But before and after that system comes the invention of superstition, the creative act, where desirous economy incorporates all the datum of the imagination. That's how superstition turns the most capricious and unexpected configurations of reality into signs. The way we read those signs is riddled with great perplexity. How did they come into the world? How did they come together? How did they come to have meaning? What unknown stories are behind them? I remember in the 60s and 70s when hallucinogens were in fashion, artisanal drugs would appear whose efficacy posed a similar problem. The question arose, how were they discovered? It didn't seem like those hippies were following the scientific method. Might they have used trial and error? For example, they smoked sun-dried tomato seeds mixed with corn silk and had beautiful, colorful visions. But where did they get the recipe? Had they first tried with flax, apple, or watermelon seeds, rejecting each in turn when they didn't produce any effect? With cardoon strands, baby hairs, fermented mustard? Impossible. There were too many elements to test and mix. All of nature, magnetized by the desire to expand consciousness beyond reason. Forgive me for laughing. He makes me laugh every time I read him, no matter how many times I've read it. Melancholy. This is page 65. Artforum hasn't arrived. A state of deep melancholy has taken hold of me. I see the world through a gray veil. Not even the best of jokes can exact a smile from me. I could die right now and I wouldn't notice the difference. Or maybe I would. It might seem like nothing. After all, nothing horrible has happened to me. But I don't need to compare my problem with those of so many people who have really serious ones. There is, however, always a lack of proportion when it comes to the human soul. Moreover, melancholy is an effect, is neither great nor small, important nor insignificant, serious nor frivolous. It's more like nothingness. It's not so much that it doesn't have any attributes as that it dilutes all of them in an impenetrable fog. And if I fantasize about the arrival of what I'm waiting for, about the satisfaction of my desire, the sadness still persists. In my fantasy, I see myself half-heartedly leafing through an art forum, or holding it on my lap without even opening it, staring off into space, expressionless, bitter. I wouldn't have expected something like this from my optimistic character, from my ability to find contentment in small things, in minimums, including minimums of meaning. I never would have imagined myself in that position because I had always taken for granted that it was the world that was depressed and that I was creating diversions, pulling them out of my festive soul. But so it is, and I feel as if this melancholy were irreversible. It's as if it had waited for centuries and millennia to ripen, as if it came from the depths of an antiquity that I didn't know. I had inside me, and antiquity that I didn't know I had inside me. And once it has opened its black corolla, it will never be able to close it again. It's an eternity, which waiting may replace into time.
Thank you, Katie.
My pleasure, indeed.
And thanks to everyone who's here. Just to let you all know, we are at 81 participants, which is a pretty massive showing. So thanks everyone for joining us here, and especially it being a pretty rough week here in the US and a lot to be down about, that to have everybody getting together to talk about a book is really fantastic, and a writer who I think is has a lot of joy and fun. So I hope we can get to have him pick up our spirits a little bit. So I thought, Katie, you know, there's a ton. Aira's written a ton of books, and there's ton still to be translated. So why this one?
Well, I personally wanted to translate it. In part because it sort of follows along with some other of his sort of nonfiction that I've translated. So I translated a chapter of his Pizarnik and On Contemporary Art, and this one I think deals with a lot of the same issues. It's sort of some of the same preoccupations, but in a different format. And I don't know all 100 of his works, but I think this is unique in the sort of in the form that it's a series of chapters of essays, sort of journal entries almost, somewhat disparate, but with a thread through it about his obsession with Artforum, which he also mentions in On Contemporary Art, and it's all part of his sort of vision of art and what he does, and yeah. So it's just really fun. It's sharp. He's just so sharp, and it's so fun to translate Aira. And I would be able to smile every draft I made. Every time I reread it, every time I corrected, I was smiling. And that's a good thing. Yeah.
Right. So then could you give a sense to everyone kind of what it's about, or what I think of as also the about. So it's about his obsession with Artforum, but it seems, I think the passages you read give an idea that it's, you know, it's about waiting, anticipation, the melancholy of anticipation or lack of fulfillment, but there's a certain deliciousness in that waiting, I think, and that sort of like everything's so much better when it's just in your imagination. So what would you, and it's, you know, it's about a guy, an alter ego or some sort of Aira himself. So what would you say it's about?
Well, I'm always hesitant to say what an Aira book is about beyond what it's about, because that's part of the trap he lays a bit. I don't know if you agree with me, Chris, but
Yeah, totally.
But I think making grand pronouncements about what a particular book or his entire literary oeuvre is about is a little bit, goes against the grain of what it's about, which is in itself a paradox. Sometimes I think when I reread parts like this, I think it's about each of these sentences. It's about each of these reflections. And yes, there are common threads. I mean, one of the common threads between this and On Contemporary Art, and I think also in landscape, you can, you know, add in your comments, Chris, if you want, but the whole idea of art as reproduction and repetition. And he comes at that from different angles, and I think he does that here, in part the repetition of his desire, the repetition of the frustration of not getting the subscription, the repetition of his joy and disappointment and frustration about getting issues of Artforum, and then Artforum itself being a way of reproducing art. And so it's, yeah. Chris?
Yeah, sorry. A way of
No,
reproducing art that tries to elude reproduction, because he has that interesting idea on contemporary art about, contemporary art always trying to do things that can't be well reproduced, and that look disappointing in photographs and videos and so on.
Right, and then that whole idea, which I think he discusses here in both places, of the narrative that goes along with the art and whether or not it's necessary. And that also is about the magazine, because there's the narrative and then there's the pictures, and always going back and forth. And so one way to look at it is that his entire oeuvre is a narrative about art, or about art in general. I mean, there's so many ways to look at it, but yeah.
Well, maybe to just talk more generally to both of you about, well, this book and his other works, but your experiences as translators. So I've read him in Spanish and English, but never translated him. So I'm curious. Oh, and just so you know, Chris, it seems like some people may have trouble hearing you. If you want to speak a little louder.
Yeah, I'll try.
Okay, great. So I think Aira for me is one of the most enjoyable writers working today for me to read. I feel like partly because there's something for me reassuring, in the busyness of life when I get these 80 or 100 page or 120 page books, just like, oh, this is going to be fun. It's going to be over soon. And I know crazy things are going to happen in that very small, span of pages. But also the style, I find that he, is for like the passage Katie read, that he really explores pretty complex themes, but in really straightforward, kind of hilarious language. So I'm just, it sounds like, Katie, he made you laugh as you were translating the book, but I'm curious about what it's like translating him, the texture of his Spanish, and if you have any anecdotes from, interactions with him. I can't help but want to hear those.
Chris, go ahead.
I was actually hoping to ask you, Katie, because you've done some amazing translations of writers whose sentences are very obviously hard to translate. So long, sprawling, or they've got stylistic fireworks of one kind or another in them. So I'm thinking of Onetti, Daniel Sada, Horacio Castellanos Moya, people like that. So anyone would say, looking at those texts, gee, that'd be hard to translate. You look at Aira, and it's not as obviously difficult. The sentences are relatively short, well-formed. There's not a lot of local idioms. There's not a lot of wordplay, and yet I don't think it's easy either. So I wanted to ask you about that. What difficulties there might be under the surface of the text.
I agree 100%. I've often said that some of the hardest texts I've translated are those that seem the easiest. So yeah, sometimes with those long sentences, I mean, to get the simplicity, the sharpness, I mean, that's what I find difficult in Aira. The simplicity, the sharpness, the sort of, it's very focused, his writing, and to never add anything, even when you feel like you need some segue or some, right? I mean, I'm sure you're shaking your head. And the other thing I found, especially in this, more than in other ones, was this theory. I mean, this narrative he has about his own narrative, which is he never rewrites, and that he never. I don't know if it's true. It's a good story. We'll never know. We'll never know. But I think I like even in the passage I just read, there's some really idiosyncratic punctuation, and I kept it here. Maybe in some of his other books I didn't as much. I maybe made it a little less jarring, but especially here because it feels like a journal, or so that also sort of how far can you go keeping his sort of idiosyncrasies. But how about you? What?
Yeah, well, no, what you just said about the temptation to add something in, that really resonated with me, because the transitions are often quite abrupt, especially in the thinky passages, you know, where he's doing some conceptual digression. And you know, he sometimes reminds me, or the metaphor that's come to my mind sometimes is, you know, there's the physicist at the blackboard demonstrating a theorem in physics. And he says, well, I'll just skip this step because you can all see that it's obvious. And he goes on to the next one.
That's perfect.
And speeds up. And then turns around and looks at you and smiles as if to suggest, well, are you really going to swallow that? You know,
right.
So there are these leaps in the digressions that sometimes get more and more wild.
Yes.
And so, yeah, you as a translator, you feel, have I missed something? Or should I intercalate something to make this clearer? But yeah, it's very delicate. It's tricky.
Well, one of the questions I had for you sort of is a good segue from that, because I have found that translating Aira, in the first book I did of his, the one about the literary conference where Carlos Fuentes, someone attempts to clone Carlos Fuentes, which I just never think about without just smiling. I feel like it's the last we need to hear about Carlos Fuentes, but no, I didn't say that. But at the beginning, there's this mechanical object, like a wench. And because it was my first book by Aira, one of the first things I say when I teach translating is you have to understand. First thing, you have to understand what you're translating, like really understand it. And I didn't really understand this mechanical contraption. So I went to an engineer, you know, who speaks Spanish. Does this make sense? And ultimately, no, it didn't make any sense. And I don't know if but then I realized what you just said about conceptual things, more abstract things. Sometimes I feel the same way about some of his sort of intellectual digressions or expansions. And like you say, there's skippings happening and he turns around and smiles at you. That's perfect, because sometimes I kind of think, well, wait a minute, does this really make sense? So I'm wondering if you've had that either about something practical, like tangible, or about something more abstract.
Yeah, both things, I think, but I think that's one of the great pleasures and stimulation. Yeah. One of the potential stimulations of reading and translating the work is that it does oblige you to ask yourself, does this really make sense?
Yeah. Yeah.
Because just, you know, when he's narrating singular events, it goes from things that are quite realistic to things that are wildly fantastic.
Yes.
And in the same way, when he's generalizing, it goes from things that are really hard to argue with, that are very good common sense, to things that are not common sense at all, that are really wild and speculative. And so there's a continuum between them, and you're always moving one way or the other on that continuum as a reader and as a translator.
That's
so
an
it's really
way to put it. Yeah.
It's vigorous mental exercise. It really is.
Right, and you don't want to stop too soon. Like, you don't want to stop trying to figure it out too soon.
No.
Yeah, you have to really, really work at it. So in that way, I mean, going back, you know, circling back to your original question, I think the difficulty, it's also in the language and keeping it clean, but it's also conceptually and just really wrapping your brain around what he's doing, what's going on the page. Yeah.
And I'm curious, just Katie, going back to you for 1 minute, you know, so you recently translated the collected stories of Juan Carlos Onetti, and those, you know, that's what, almost 600 pages, you know, linguistically dense, kind of narratively elliptical. It's hard to figure out. What were you working on that the same year that you did this book? Because these, I mean, they're from the same place, but such wildly different experiences as translators. So I'm just curious about that.
Well, no, that goes back to why did I want to translate this? It was, I think they offered it to me sort of after I'd finished Onetti and Ribeiro, and it was sort of like, oh yes, please, yes, please, something entirely different on every level. Yeah, so it was, you know, sort of exercising different muscles. Like, if you run one day, you ride your bike the next. So that was,
And also Onetti's so dark, and Aira is really, it's kind of jubilant.
But there's a very, I would argue, I don't know, Chris, how you feel, or anybody, but I think there's a very dark undercurrent. But then maybe that's just because I feel pretty dark these days.
No, I agree. Yeah, I
Would
think,
you
and I
agree?
think that's there in Artforum too. There's the wonderful chapter where he bags 24, I think,
Yeah.
issues of Artforum in one day and goes home and a friend gives him a fountain pen. When he's a great collector of fountain pens, he goes home and he says it was one of those days where you felt that if every day was like this, life would be perfect. And then there's the melancholia chapter that you just read. So there's a sort of balance between those.
And I think, go ahead, I'm sorry.
No, you go.
Well, I was just going to say, I think there's a lot of that in Aira. When I think after reading it and saying I wanted to translate it, I wrote to the folks at ND and said, I can't figure out if this is utterly banal or sheer genius. and I still, I think parts are both, either both going back and forth, but I think it's the same thing, this straddling this line and sort of going within one paragraph, possibly going from one to the other. So that's fascinating to me. But I think also it's breaking down that distinction. I think he's playing with us. Like, really, you think it's genius? Like, what is genius and where are we? And yeah, I think there's some of that going on too, this kind of teasing us out of our complacency about certain concepts and certain ways we see the world, right?
Yeah.
So I guess I'm curious if you know how much truth there is to, just in case people don't know this story around Aira's process, which is that he never revises. He kind of lets himself get carried away by the arbitrary choices he makes early, in the manuscript, and lets them go wherever they take him. And then he kind of figures out the cleanest way to tie the bow and finish it. And I think there's some, like, if anyone's read Baramo, which is that, I think that's one where he really pulled it off at the end and brings it back. But I'm curious if you know if that's true, and if you were tempted to translate in the same way.
Well, I think there's some truth to the story about the flight forward. No, a lot of truth to the story of the flight forward procedure, but it's not totally true. So when I was translating the short story Cecil Taylor about the great jazz pianist Cecil Taylor, I was translating a version that was published in an anthology in called Buenos Aires. Quite a long time ago, and when I was nearly finished, I got an email from César Aira saying, "But this has been republished in a newer illustrated edition, and I rewrote it." Ooh. So I got the new version, and having already done the old version, I could see very clearly that it's basically the same story. There are a lot of changes at the sentence 2, 3, 4 sentence level. He did the same thing with another story called The Spy in the musical brain. Recently, he republished a book called El Juego de los Mundos, which is also a rewrite of an earlier book. So I think when he's obliged to go back and reread something when it's being republished, he often thinks, no, I've got to sort that out, got to fix that. So it's at the same time, he definitely does use this forward momentum that he gets from adding a small amount each day to a novel in progress, and trying to resolve any plot complications by adding retrospective explanations. So that's one of his techniques. And to come back to what you said, Aaron, about Baramo, I think in that case he must have had a sense that he was going to end the book with Baramo sitting down to write the poem with the documents that he extracts from his pockets. I mean, it's a brilliant idea to send the book to that end point. So in that way, it's not really a flight forward novel. I don't think. I mean, I don't have any special insight into the genesis of that book, but
there's also, in that book, I remember there's this character, I think, who puts think who leaves a popsicle or something stuck to a leaf of the tree, and then I think another character right near the end comes back and sees this thing and thinks it's this transcendental object, and then it's just that again, who knows if that feels like possibly it's a little more something that occurred to him and he saw a way to tie back in, but yeah, the sort of the overall structural premise feels almost too clever to just wing that at the end.
Yeah, I think so. Yeah. But the flight forward, the motif of the flight forward is part of, I mean, in interviews, he has a number of strategies, possibly for, keeping things simple that are not exactly reflected by his practice in the work.
Mm-hmm.
So he has.
What do you mean by that?
Sorry, Catherine.
No, just I wanted you to explain that more. Just.
Oh, so he. So, for example, saying I never rewrite. There are. Just can't. The interviews are really. There's a whole kind of discourse in the interviews that is very funny, very very interesting, but simplifies the actual practice. I'm sorry, I'm struggling to find a good example offhand.
Well, so I had another. I had another question for Chris about something I have found in, which is it's a little translator nerdy, if I may. Can I get translator nerdy? So I have found that in some of his books, probably in all of them, but two come to mind very strongly, that there's like a key word. I don't know if you found this at all, Chris, but in Miracle Cures of Dr. Aira, it's a word that when I find it, it's as if I get the book, and the tone, everything kind of falls around it. So in Miracle Cures, it was blunder. It was the idea of blunder when I found that word, I just knew that was the right word. And because it all had to do with regret and having made mistakes, but mistake wasn't right. But anyway, blunder. And in Dinner, which is about the zombies that rise out of the cemetery, and starts with a dinner. This man who lives with his mother, César Aira, who lives with his mother, and they go to a home, and it has to do with all these miniature toys, and but then the zombies, the brain. So what they do, the way they eat when they come out of their coffins, is they slurp. And so when I found the word slurp, also, I felt like the whole book just happened. I don't know if you've had this experience. I just reread the episode, your translation of the episode, which is brilliant. And I love the grumpy mule. I thought somebody could have said cranky, but grumpy is just perfect. Cranky would not have done it. Grumpy was just perfect. So, and I don't know if you have found other words like that carry you through a book.
Yeah. I can't think of an example from my own experience, but I can see exactly what you mean with that. And in the two examples you cited, so one of them is the blunder. That's really neat, because it's a little bit like a reflection of his own storytelling process. You make a blunder and then you try to correct it by saying something to soften it or to excuse yourself, and you just dig yourself deeper and deeper into a hole. It's like a liar who lies and then has to invent more complicated lies to protect himself or herself. It's a little bit like this flight forward procedure. So everything gets more and more complicated, and eventually Aira himself sometimes has to, instead of tying up the knot, he has to slash it. He has to cut the knot at the price of leaving some loose ends.
Yes, exactly. Yeah.
So I wanted to ask one more question before then we can start. We're getting some great questions from people here, so we should go to those. But I was wondering, how should we read Artforum and other books of his in terms of their autobiographical content, or there being a character named César Aira? Because I think in general, my senses of kind of autofiction today, thinking people like Ben Lerner, Rachel Cusk, it's often kind of very serious. That feels like that autobiographical searching. Whereas Aira just seems to be making fun of himself constantly, and it's this send up of the neurotic person. So I'm just curious how, I can't, you can't help but, he calls himself César Aira, and he kind of has a lot of things in common. So it's very tempting to just be like, oh, this is him, except until like, in the literary conference when there's suddenly like, is it a robot, that's destroying everything? I can't remember how that ends, but it's great. It goes from feeling like very autobiographical, him being neurotic at a literary conference, to then there's this like robot that's,
Well, they're blue worms. If I remember correctly. Blue worms rolling down the hillside after having, instead of the moths or the mosquitoes or the whatever, gnat, some insect, I forget what it was, going into Carlos Fuentes and getting his DNA, they went into his blue eye, which is just perfect. And so their blue weren't right. So what gets reproduced, again, reproduction, what gets reproduced is the blue silk worms that destroy the city. But then everything's made right again, sort of like with the zombies. So
how do you both interpret? Someone just commented that there's totally a Curb Your Enthusiasm quality to his autofiction, which I think that's the perfect equivalent, I think.
Well, I mean, this book, when I said I feel it's somewhat unique, it doesn't pretend to be fiction, really. I mean, in that respect, he's not creating an alternate world. These are essays about really almost blatantly autobiographical about his obsession, how much it's true. I mean, whether the rain came in. I mean, I did look up the corner he says he lives on. I don't know, Chris, if you've visited him in Buenos Aires, but
I haven't, no.
So I did look up the corner, and there is a bakery right where he says, and it is a corner apartment. And so I looked it up on Google Maps just for fun to sort of see, and it all looks like he describes it. So, I don't know. I don't know if he had a day when all the clothespins broke. I'm not sure if that's true. That's one of the chapters, about a day when all the clothespins started to break. And then he goes on this whole meditation of form, and whether form can be worn out the way material can. But I don't know if that happened. If he was sitting and writing, and one day the clothes, what is it called? The laundry, what are they called? Clothespins suddenly started breaking.
Yeah. I mean, it's in that chapter there where you have a lovely formula, form fatigue, for what happens to the pegs. It's not that it's not material fatigue, because they're all made of different materials.
That's right.
Some are wooden, some are plastic. So
and
it's
they all right, and they all come from different places. Some are made in China, some are made in Argentina. So he sort of discounts all these other reasons why they were all bought at different times. So he discounts all these other reasons why they would have fallen apart all at the same time. So form fatigue,
Yeah, so there's a kind of beginnings of fiction there, but just the beginnings. Similarly, perhaps in Birthday, which is not pretending to be fiction, it seems pretty much like a memoir. But a book like The Lime Tree, which is in the first person, and ostensibly about his childhood in Coronel Pringles, I think there's quite a lot of fiction in there. Where exactly the dividing line between autobiography and fiction is very hard to know. It's very slippery. It's this continuum between relating autobiographical facts or memories and fabulating freely. It's hard to draw the line.
Right. I mean, it made me think of his book Conversation, which is actually, it isn't talked about very much, but it's actually, I think, in some ways, my favorite book that I translated of his. And on the one hand, it's really an exploration of friendship. It's sort of more humanistic than many of his works. There's this tenderness there about what friendship is about, very insightful. But on the other hand, it's this Ukrainian, mafia story about a movie filmed in the Ukraine, and it's pretty wild. So, but it's contained within that. This is a movie that was seen by both him and his friends. So, again, yes, very smudgy lines.
Yes. Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, I'm wondering if we can do a rapid fire. We have a lot of good questions here. If we could do a rapid fire answering to try to get to as many as possible in the next maybe 10 or 15 minutes. So real quick, so what does tokade mean?
So both tokade and lubia, so the word he used was lubia. And as he explained to me, it comes from the French lubie, which means whim or caprice. And so I'm not sure why I didn't use the same word and just make it English. I must have had a reason, but instead I found another word in French, tokade, that also means something similar, though it has a little bit more of a meaning of a fling, a romantic fling, but still a kind of a whim or yeah. So they're synonyms in French, and then I kind of made them into English, and he made it from French. So yeah.
Great. That was from Matthew Spencer. So from Jared Anis said, I read a piece about Aira which mentioned the tumultuous socio-political time he's experienced and lived through, and his conscious choice to, maybe a typo, to not write about it directly, or to,
yeah,
I'm not
I would
sure.
say not. Yeah.
Do you feel like this colors his writing in other ways? I'm thinking of the pervading dark undercurrent Katherine mentioned.
Well, one of he sort of makes two really interesting points on contemporary art. One is one Chris mentioned about art always trying to be ahead of the ability to reproduce it. But the other thing he talks about is just the name on contemporary art. Like when you call a movement that, then it's endless because it's always contemporary. So what comes after contemporary art? Maybe end time. It's the end time. And so that to me is a little bit of the darkness under his work. It's almost like there's something final. Maybe, again, this might be my projection because I feel the world this way quite often, if not always, but we're sort of at the end of a civilization. We're at the end of a culture. And there's something in that, in Aira, there's something that he's exploring there. It's hard for me to put it in other words, but that sort of comes as close as I can.
Yeah, and perhaps to think about how some things are present in the background that he never really thematizes in his work. So in Artforum, for example, that there's a chapter that's dated 1997, and he talks about buying copies of Artforum for $10. That is 10 pesos. So it's the time when the peso is pegged to the dollar. The years of the so-called sweet money in Argentina under Menem, when lots of Argentinians were traveling and had the sense that this possibly wasn't going to last. Then there's another chapter, which is after the big meltdown in 2001, when he finally subscribes to the magazine, and he gets a little note from the Artforum people saying, best wishes to you in Argentina, as if they're surprised that, with everything falling apart in the country, he's taking out a subscription to a sophisticated art magazine. So that stuff, he would never write a novel about the financial and political crisis of 2001 taking that as a theme, but it works its way in to the fiction.
And then there's also that reverie he has about, I think somehow when he's going to get the magazine, something happened in him getting a bullet to the chest, which is another way of kind of sublimating the climate of violence, in his kind of in his comedic or neurotic way.
Yeah.
So here's another great question. As an English reader only, are Aira's untranslated books similar to those already translated? They are so varied in scope, but most of those translated in English thus far are shorter, conceptually dense, and with a strong surrealistic streak. Any new ones on the way, meaning kind of, I think, of other ones to be translated, or any that contrast with that? That's, I think, a great observation about most of his work that's found its way into English so far.
Most of the later books are short and conceptually dense like that. There's an early one called Canto Castrato, which was his attempt to write a bestseller, which is quite relatively long. It's like a normal sized novel, but as a bestseller, it failed. But it's a very interesting book. I find it a very seductive book. Other ones coming, there are a couple more in the pipeline with new directions. The Famous Magician and The Divorce is coming at some point. They're both short. I don't know, Katie, if you've got other ones.
No, nothing on the back burner. No.
All right. Let's see, from Sydney Wilson. Do you think the spirit or personality of a book is altered or lessened when translating to a different language?
Depends how good the translator is, to a certain extent. I hate to say that, but no, it's, altered maybe. I don't know. I don't know how to answer that exactly, Chris.
Yeah, I don't know. I guess I would say there are always shifts. There are always shifts. I guess it's to take up your point about the skill of the translator. It's how those shifts are balanced and patterned, and how compensations are engineered here and there. It's a tough question to answer.
It is. It's hard. It's a case by case situation, I believe, and really, the proof is in the pudding, in the sense of if you read it, and if you read both languages, and you read both. But I mean, the translation has to stand on its own as a literary work without reference to the original. I mean, that is sort of a very basic idea. So some things are lost. Maybe some things are gained sometimes. We don't know.
Interestingly, I've read several different of his novels translated into English by different translators, put out by New Directions, and I always felt like it was a very similar, consistent voice, even though I'm sure you all would have made different individual choices. So in that sense, I feel like there is a spirit which, even being passed through different people into English, comes through very clearly in all of his books.
I tend to think that really good writers can survive even bad translations.
That's a great quote. It's what we should all aspire to be, that we can't be slaughtered by a bad translator. Let's see. This is from Amanda Kassar. Are there any images, sentences, phrases, or chapters in Artforum that haunt you as particularly impossible to translate correctly? That is, parts you're not sure English is equipped to properly express, which is kind of speaking to the same idea.
Not really, though I would say that, for instance, the last chapter, when he talks about Adam, I can't say fully that I understand what he's doing there. I could theorize what it means in terms of the whole book, but on the page, like if you take the last paragraph, I mean, I could read it. I'm not sure I fully grasped it. I don't think it's a problem of language. I don't know if I fully grasped it in Spanish or if it makes much sense, but shall I read the last paragraph? Or, wait, what am I doing? Oh, sorry. He talks about forms again. So he's talking about Adam, the first man, and how wise he was because he was close to the origins. He was close to the beginning. He says, as Adam, he could almost touch the end of the universe, which was expanding like the corolla of a flower preparing to be the all. Forms were born, wrapped in the shimmering dampness. They grew sharper as they felt their way along, successively adopting the line, the plane, volume, aligning themselves in the perspective of an infinite d'oeil. Gravity intervened, and each thing making its debut found its place. Mountains and suns, galaxies and roses. Adam heard the very first bird song.
Yeah,
I accept it kind of as poetry, in that it's not completely lineal thinking, and it's, yeah.
Yeah, I love the way he ended the book in that way. It's really wonderful. This is a great one.
Sorry. With a beginning.
Yes.
Exactly. The beginning.
Maybe.
This is a great question because as we were talking about his, his sort of sprint forward approach, Charles Obendorf says he said, I love Aira's voice and I love him paragraph by paragraph, but I get frustrated by his very loose approach to story structure. What are the best titles to read first to get over this prejudice, or is there no hope?
If you're looking for a radical cure for the prejudice, maybe the literature conference or the proof, perhaps. The proof is a book which executes a very abrupt shift between genres. So it's got quite the first 2/3 of the book is quite realistic and very much conversation based, and then there's a place where you can put your finger on the sentence where it jumps from that sort of psychological realism into something like an action movie, a very violent action movie, where the characters are just supports for action. So that's the shock cure, if you like. The gentle cure, I don't know. The gentle cure is to start at the other end with something like Artforum or the Lime Tree. That doesn't shake the reader up so violently, I guess.
I mean, I would say conversation maybe in that vein, because there is a thread, which is this conversation between two friends. Even though it goes into a wacky place, but it comes back. It comes back to this conversation, and it sort of hangs around this. And it also has, I think, a more of an emotional underpinning than some of his other books, but yeah.
Let's see, from Tracy Conway, a question about senselessness, Moya's novel. Were the native people's statements written in a different regional dialect?
Wow. Yes, they were written in distorted syntax in the original, slightly distorted. So they were written in the way Guatemalan indigenous people speak Spanish who have learned it as a second language.
Right.
Yes. So I attempted to mirror that in English to a certain extent, this awkward, slightly awkward quality, if I remember correctly. It was a long time ago.
That is, for anyone looking for another of Katherine's books, Senselessness, and also New Directions, I think, an incredible novel.
Yeah, it is. It holds up.
Let's see, question from Jeannie Benasco, who's an amazing writer herself. I love her work. I'm wondering if how translating Aira has influenced your own writing. Also, thanks so much for this evening.
I think what we talked about earlier, this lack of segue, and I think in the part I read, there were a couple examples of that. Is sort of, you say something and then you can just say the opposite and you don't really need to explain. And I think that has sunk into me a little bit. There are moments where I allow myself to do that in my own writing that I might not have without Aira's. Yeah.
Yeah, I think he's a great example of freedom and risk taking. Mm-hmm. And the thing he says on Contemporary Art about the whatever as the open sesame of creation is quite liberating. Even if after having put in the whatever you decide to revise it away or to modify it somehow.
Right. Yeah, and that even on the sentence level, just not having to be so rational in the prose, like bringing in that elliptical quality, which I really appreciate. And yeah, it's liberating in that respect. Yeah.
Great. Three more questions, which if we can tear through them in 5 minutes, it'll be an hour, and almost everyone has hung in here with us. So from Ron Restrepo in Houston, he said, you always have a sense of where you are in his books and stories. How do you handle this part of translations to get that sense of place?
I think that's, one of Aira's great talents is creating atmospheres with a few touches here and there He's a very visual writer, and he said sometimes that this is all down to reading Superman comics as a kid. He said somewhere that he went straight from Superman to Borges. And I think he is a very vivid scene setter. And so in translation, you know, in a sense that work is done for us. We just have to not spoil it too much.
I agree. I think it's about sticking close to the text and trusting his choices, and then trying to work with that and not, yeah.
Great. So this is a beautifully phrased question. Some section, and it's this question I had, some sections are dated of Artforum are dated at the end and others aren't. Do you think this may have something to do with the broken clothespins? Like some of it is bound by time, rationality, and some of it outside of it, magical. Do you think it's valid to call Aira magical rationalism as a reaction to magical realism? That's one of those questions that's so well put. You just want to let it.
I don't think it needs an answer. I think it's great. Why not?
Very attractive formula, magical rationalism. I like it a lot.
Yeah, exactly.
I'll read, and then a question from Paul Malazewski. What are your each of your favorite Aira books? I'll say Badamo is, I think, mine.
Of the ones I've translated and know well, Conversation, I would say.
I have a soft spot for Shantytown. But, you know, yeah, it's hard to choose.
But I mean, we haven't said this yet, but there is a way in which all of these books are part of one book. And I think it's important to sort of, as you're reading chapters, you're reading, right? I mean, wouldn't you say that, Chris, in a way? Yeah, I think
Absolutely.
Aira, more than almost any other writer, there's a project.
Absolutely. I agree completely. And I think, is it in the Miracle Cures of Dr. Aira where he talks about his fascicles or his booklets? And
Yes, exactly. Yes, I forgot about that. Exactly. Yeah.
So, you know, he is conceiving of them all being chapters, or right. In Birthday he talks about them as preparatory documentation for the great encyclopedia that he's composed. Right. It's, you know, ironic. It's not a kind of real executable project, but
it's also a dig at Borges. It's also a little dig at Borges. Not a dig, but a reference to, a nod. Even in Artforum, there's when he takes on this project of creating his own art forums. Yeah. And they also become these little booklets, right? And right.
All right. The last question from Douglas Curran is about, I'll paraphrase, is just about influences, which I think, if we're talking about magic realism and what was going on in South America, and I think Aira's real difference from a lot of his region's writers. So where do you locate his influences?
Influences on him?
Influences on his writing. Comic books and Borges, some mashup of something like that. Yeah.
Kafka, I think, is important for him.
Proust, more than we would like to think. There's a lot of Proust in him.
Yeah, The Lime Tree is a really Proustian book. You know, at the beginning of the book, his father is going to collect lime tree blossom to make tea because it helps him to, or linden tree blossom, to helps him to sleep. There's clearly an allusion to the episode in Combray with the infusion of linden tea.
I think all Argentinian writers have to deal with Borges. It's just like he's this monster in the room that it is just, I mean, not monster, but a very large presence, let's say. And I think Aira's done it in his way. Each Argentinian writer since Borges has done it in their own way. And I think Aira's it's great. I mean, I think it's quite interesting. But there also, one thing we haven't mentioned is Aira also made his living for many years as a translator of genre literature. So his familiarity with genre literature and the way he uses that in his work, I find it just wonderful. Clearly, he has a very high intimacy. And he would always joke about how he would rewrite and these books because they were, you know, right.
Yeah.
They were not high literary works.
Great. Well, I think that's puts us right now at 5:30 on the West Coast, 8:30, and Chelsea's back, I think, to tell us about how to buy the book. So everyone, buy the book. Thank you all for coming.
Thank you.
Thank you guys so much for this wonderful conversation, and thank all of you for showing up tonight. In case you missed any part of tonight's event, or you have friends who missed tonight's event, a reminder that it has been recorded, so keep an eye out for it on our website and other channels later on. And a reminder that you can buy Artforum through greenlightbookstore.com. And if you buy before June 5th, you can get $5 off with code Aira. Thanks again, everyone, so much. It was a pleasure to host this tonight, and have a wonderful evening, everyone. Bye.
Thank you. Thank everybody for coming and listening.
Take
Thank
care.
you, Chris and Aaron.